Imagine what it'd be like for Paul to confront Peter. Paul is acknowledged in the scriptures that he considers himself an apostle who was born kind of at the wrong time almost, that he didn't share in the same kind of apostleship that the rest of them did. Peter is the one who preaches the first sermon at Pentecost. Peter is the one that traveled with Jesus and was kind of the head of the disciples while he was here on this earth and ministering with them. Peter was the one that, travels and preaches, and we're seeing conversions and miracles and all these things happening in his midst. And then comes along Paul. And Paul's a persecutor of the church who becomes transformed and begins to serve. And yet the day comes when Peter, that's Cephas, comes to Antioch where Paul is, and Paul opposes him to his face because he says the problem is Peter, remember we have Jesus traveling, and we looked at this when we were in Leviticus with the food laws. Jesus declares all foods clean. Then we have in the book of Acts that Peter is sent to Cornelius' house, and he has the vision, and God says, what I have made clean, no longer call unclean. And he sees the Gentiles receive the Holy Spirit, and he knows the Gentiles can be saved, and he goes back and he reports these things. And so he's obviously seen this before. And we get an idea here from what Paul is saying that Peter actually, began to minister, and it made no difference whether a person was Jewish or Gentile or what rituals they did or whether they'd been circumcised or not, didn't matter to him. But then he came to a place where some men from James come, and they have a concern, and he says he's fearing the party of the circumcision. What this means is that Peter begins to change his actions because he's afraid of how a certain group will receive him. There were a group of men who thought to be a true Christian, you needed to have the circumcision that the Jews had to enter into the covenant. You needed to follow Jewish customs. You, in essence, needed to become a Jew first, and then that's how you could faithfully live out your Christianity. And even though Peter never taught this, Peter's actions suggest this. See, the interesting thing is Paul does not say, I came and I confronted Peter about his heresy, that he was preaching a wrong gospel. Paul doesn't say that. Paul says, I came and confronted him for his hypocrisy. The rest of the Jews joined him in the hypocrisy. Even Barnabas, the son of encouragement, is carried away by this hypocrisy. What it did was it put a stumbling block out there. Yes, they were preaching a gospel where only Jesus saves by his grace through faith. But then, because he would only eat with those, he would only associate with those, he began to only fellowship with those who also tried to live according to the law. Paul looks and says, your actions don't match your words, Pete. You're declaring a gospel that's only salvation by Christ, but your actions suggest to other people that it's in the fulfillment of the law that a person is saved. And so Paul sees this as a gospel issue worth getting involved in and says, do you not understand that what is happening here is you are sending a message that a man could be justified by the law? And he says, Peter, you have understood your freedom from the law because Christ perfectly fulfilled it, and yet you're trying to bound those who never had the law underneath the law. You can't receive justification by the law. You can't be made righteous with God by the law. He says, no, instead it has to be by faith alone that it comes. So we get to the end, the beautiful verse where he says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me. This reminds us of, Paul says in Romans chapter 14, that anything that is not of faith is sin. And so here we can even see Paul is saying that the life I live because Christ has died and I died with him and I have been raised to life by his resurrection, I then don't live my own life, but I walk out my life by faith. And he says, Peter, your actions are sending a different message. Your gospel you preach is fine, but your actions send a different message. This helps us see that it's not always just an issue of engaging a brother about teaching that they might be wrong about doctrine that they may have missed, about a gospel that they've just gotten a little fuzzy on. This is why it's so important to watch our life closely. Because in watching our life, we can be consistent with the gospel that we preach. And so Paul loves Peter enough, loves the church enough, loves the Jews and the Gentiles that are there in Antioch enough, loves Christ and his gospel so much that he's willing to go and confront Peter about this, not to punish Peter, not to embarrass Peter, not to drag Peter down, but to allow God to use Peter to his maximum glory by having his message and his actions line up. Every one of us runs into those times where we need someone to come along beside us and say, do you realize that the actions you're living right now do not match the gospel that you proclaim, and therefore your evangelism is going to be tainted because people aren't going to see you walking the talk that you proclaim.